This tale begins with knights praised as holy warriors, defenders of faith and pilgrims. Yet beneath the hymns of praise lies another truth, hidden for centuries, a truth they carried with them to the grave. The Knights Templar are remembered in history as protectors of weary travelers walking the perilous roads to Jerusalem. They were the guardians of the faithful, armed and consecrated, a brotherhood devoted to God. Their banners were raised with the cross and their oaths sworn in solemn chapels, but the memory passed down through centuries tells only part of their story. Behind the public face of holiness, shadows gathered, and those shadows hid something far older than Christendom itself. But before we begin, tell me, where are you watching this from tonight? Write it below, because every story like this becomes more powerful when it carries the voices of those who hear it. The Knights Templar are remembered in history as protectors of weary travelers walking the perilous roads to Jerusalem. They were the guardians of the faithful, armed and consecrated, a brotherhood devoted to God. Their banners were raised with the cross and their oaths sworn in solemn chapels. But the memory passed down through centuries tells only part of their story. Behind the public face of holiness, shadows gathered, and those shadows hid something far older than Christendom itself. The year 1119 marked the beginning of their rise, but it was also the year whispers began. 9 knights, men of noble birth yet sworn to poverty, established themselves not in castles or along roads, but in Jerusalem itself. They chose as their dwelling the Temple Mount, a place drenched in memory, built over ruins that stretched back to Solomon's time. While pilgrims sought blessings above, the knights were drawn below, where ancient stones held secrets no priest dared speak. Jerusalem was sacred not only for Christians but also for Jews and Muslims who saw within the Temple Mount the trace of divine presence. Yet it was more than holy soil. It was an archive of civilizations buried beneath centuries of war and conquest. Beneath those stones lingered foundations older than temples, walls swallowed by dust and fire, vaults that remembered hands long forgotten. It was here, on this contested ground, that the Templars began their silent work. What were they seeking? Not coins, not relics of saints, but fragments of something far more dangerous. Rumors claimed they descended into tunnels left untouched since antiquity. For nearly 9 years, they lived not as guardians on open roads, but as keepers of hidden paths under the mount itself. Their blades were for defense, but their true tools were silence and secrecy. Each night spent not in rest, but in excavation and discovery. The world outside believed the Templars were knights without stain, pious and selfless. Kings bestowed land upon them, popes granted privileges, nobles bent in respect. Yet within Jerusalem's stones these men pursued a different calling. Each layer of earth unearthed beneath the mount whispered not of prophets or apostles, but of a kingdom drowned in myth, its echoes traveling through symbols etched in forgotten rock. They were not merely knights of Christ. They were seekers of something buried before history began. The world around the Templars changed quickly. Pilgrims still poured into Jerusalem, drawn by faith, yet their eyes never saw what unfolded within the temple walls. Ordinary men and women believed the knights were sacrificing comfort to protect them, and that faith grew into admiration. But admiration can blind, and the knights knew it. Their silence became the shield that concealed their deeper mission, a silence more powerful than any sword raised on the battlefield. In Europe, kings and princes began to notice. Land was granted, privileges bestowed, and papal bulls carved authority into stone. The Templars became untouchable, shielded not only by armor, but by law and sanctity. They moved across borders without paying taxes, answered to no local lord, and grew in influence faster than any order before them. But privilege is rarely free. Behind the veil of power, the weight of secrets pressed harder, as if the very earth demanded its due. 9 years passed in Jerusalem while the order was still young, and their choice of residence never ceased to raise questions. Why remain within those walls instead of securing roads or guarding caravans? Why inhabit the Temple Mount itself, where layers of history lay buried in silence? To the world, they were protectors of faith. To themselves, they were custodians of mysteries unearthed one fragment at a time, each discovery reshaping their understanding of what truly lay beneath Jerusalem's soil. Whispers began to spread, carried by merchants and envoys who watched from afar. Some spoke of tunnels opened at night, others of stone fragments carried out under cloaks. There were tales of scrolls so ancient that even scholars could not identify their script, and of symbols resembling waves, spirals, and stars carved into forgotten rock. No priest confirmed these tales, and no knight spoke of them, but the silence itself gave weight to the rumors that refused to die. Their reputation soared precisely because no one could pierce the shroud around their true work. A paradox was born. The less they revealed, the more powerful they seemed. To challenge them was to challenge the Church itself, for even the Pope declared them blessed. This alliance of faith and secrecy ensured that their mission would continue unbroken, hidden in plain sight. Yet with each year that passed, the line between holy duty and forbidden pursuit grew more fragile, trembling beneath the weight of discovery. The stage was set for a revelation that could shatter faith or reshape it forever. The Templars walked a path between glory and damnation, between service to Christ and service to something older, nameless and drowned in time. Their silence was not weakness, but design crafted to outlast their enemies and shield their truth until death. And now, as we peel away the centuries, remain with us, for what they unearthed is darker, deeper, and more perilous than history ever dared confess. Stay until the end. You will want to know what was never meant to be spoken. The roots of the Templar mission were planted in blood and fire. The First Crusade had torn Jerusalem from Muslim control in 1099, leaving the city scarred but celebrated as the jewel of Christendom. Pilgrims streamed in from across Europe, drawn by the promise of touching the very stones where prophets once walked. Yet the same roads that carried faith were drenched in danger, and countless pilgrims fell victim to thieves, raiders, and desert marauders before reaching the holy city. Into this chaos stepped 9 knights, men who swore not only to fight but to live as monks. They rejected wealth, wore plain robes beneath their armor, and pledged their lives to poverty and discipline. At their head stood Hugues de Payan, remembered as a man of resolve whose vision carried the order beyond obscurity. What made them different was not their skill with the sword, but their willingness to bind themselves to rules as rigid as stone. Their choice of headquarters shocked even their allies. Instead of castles or fortified walls, they settled on the Temple Mount itself, a plateau already sacred to Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. It was believed to be the site where King Solomon's legendary temple once rose, a sanctuary whispered to hold treasure, wisdom, and forgotten relics. By placing themselves at this site, the knights proclaimed their mission not just as guardians of pilgrims, but as guardians of a mystery far older than their order. From the outside, this decision seemed like a statement of faith, a gesture of humility and sacrifice. But those who lived in Jerusalem watched closely and wondered why the knights rarely patrolled the dangerous roads. For nearly 9 years, they remained anchored to the mount, leaving others to protect the caravans. To the faithful, their presence was reassurance. To the suspicious, their silence was unsettling. Something more was unfolding in those chambers of stone. The Temple Mount was not merely ground consecrated by scripture. It was layered history, where Roman legions once stood, where Byzantine churches had fallen, and where Islamic caliphs built their sanctuaries. Beneath its surface lay strata of civilizations collapsed into dust, foundations untouched for centuries. To dwell there was to live among ghosts, but to dig there was to stir voices that had been buried since the dawn of time. The Templars chose to dwell, and whispers said they did more than dwell. Thus the legend began to grow, not of knights riding into battle, but of men descending into shadows. Tales hinted that beneath the temple lay passages carved before Christ, before Solomon, perhaps before memory itself. And if those tales hold truth, then the Templars were not merely soldiers of the cross, but seekers of something far more dangerous. If you wish to follow this hidden trail through centuries, subscribe now, and let the secrets buried beneath Jerusalem rise again through the telling of their story. The vows of the Templars were spoken with the weight of eternity. Each knight promised obedience, chastity, and poverty. But within the Temple Mount, their oaths carried another meaning. They pledged loyalty not only to Christ, but to secrets still sleeping beneath the ruins. The world saw them as warriors consecrated to God, yet within the walls they had chosen, they bound themselves to a silence that no scripture had written, a silence more binding than their swords. Life among the order was rigid, almost inhuman. Meals were plain, often bread and broth. Sleep was short, taken in shared quarters with weapons always at hand. Conversation was sparse, and laughter was rare. Every act of daily life was shaped by discipline. Yet this outward austerity hid another purpose. Beneath their piety, the knights preserved rituals whispered only to a chosen few, rituals that connected them not just to Jerusalem's holiness, but to the earth beneath their feet. To the pilgrims, they were models of sacrifice. To kings and popes, they were champions of faith. But among themselves, they became something different, custodians of forbidden memory. Stories tell of nights when candles burned low, and voices recited prayers not from church liturgy, but from texts no priest would bless. They were not heretics, not in their own eyes. They were seekers, convinced that what they uncovered would strengthen their mission, even if the church never learned of it. Their choice of the Temple Mount was not an accident of convenience. It was deliberate, almost defiant. They believed that to guard the faith, one must stand where faith had once been born. They lived on top of ruins, older than the crusade itself, older than the city's shifting rulers. To dwell there was to live at the center of a spiritual storm, and perhaps to listen for echoes of voices buried beneath centuries of conquest and blood. 9 years within those walls created questions that no chronicler could answer. Why did they not ride daily into battle? Why did they remain enclosed in chambers of stone while others fought at the frontiers? The official explanation was devotion, but devotion does not demand silence for nearly a decade. Their true vow was not only to protect travelers on sacred roads, but to guard something hidden below the foundations, something too dangerous to be spoken aloud. It is here, in their vows and their silence, that the path turns from history into legend. For what they protected was not visible, not written in chronicles or sung in hymns. It was concealed, guarded by secrecy and sacrifice. And as we continue this story, remember that silence can be more revealing than words. Tell me what you think. Were the Templars guardians of pilgrims or guardians of secrets? Share your thoughts below and let us see how far the truth might reach. For nearly 9 years, the Templars remained anchored to the Temple Mount, a decision that defied explanation, even in their own age. Knights were expected to patrol roads, escort caravans, and fight raiders, yet the order chose instead to dwell in silence within ancient stone. Their absence from the highways created suspicion, and rumors spread among merchants and pilgrims alike. Few could understand why the defenders of faith seemed to prefer the underground shadows to the open battlefield. Whispers told of hidden tunnels running beneath the plateau, sealed chambers that had not been touched since empires fell into dust. Some claimed the knights brought tools disguised beneath cloaks, lowering them into passages by night. Others spoke of strange markings etched into tablets, fragments carried out and quickly concealed. None of these tales were confirmed, but the longer the silence endured, the more people believed the order was engaged in a work never meant to be seen by mortal eyes. The Temple Mount itself was no ordinary foundation. It was a layered monument where Jewish kings once built, Roman soldiers once marched, and Muslim caliphs raised their sanctuaries. Beneath the surface lay centuries of buried civilizations, collapsed walls and forgotten vaults. To dwell there was to walk atop history itself, and to dig there was to disturb truths older than Scripture. The knights did not avoid that truth. They sought it, convinced that what slumbered below held the key to a deeper legacy. What they uncovered remains uncertain, but the silence surrounding those years speaks louder than any chronicle. Chroniclers describe little of their daily tasks, as if their existence vanished from record. This void in history was not accidental. It was intentional, crafted by an order that understood the danger of revelation. Whatever was unearthed could not be paraded before kings or priests. It was too strange, too threatening, a knowledge that demanded burial as much as discovery. Legends suggest they found relics not of saints or prophets, but of civilizations long drowned. Some describe fragments resembling maps, others speak of inscriptions that did not match Hebrew, Greek, or Latin, but seemed carved in patterns echoing waves and spirals. To those who later pieced together the whispers, it was evidence of a lost empire, one whose name survived only in myth, Atlantis. If true, then the knights carried not relics of the cross, but warnings from a world consumed by water. The strangeness of those 9 years became the heart of Templar legend. Their choice to remain underground rather than ride into war is the silence that history cannot explain away. And as this silence deepens, so too does the shadow of the truth they guarded. To continue unraveling what they uncovered, do not rely only on memory. Enable notifications now so that when the next revelation rises, you will be here to witness it before it fades into silence again. In the silence of the Temple Mount, discoveries began to take shape. Beneath the foundations beyond the reach of sunlight, chambers were uncovered that did not belong to the age of Crusaders, nor to Solomon, nor even to the Romans who had once ruled the city. The air carried a weight of centuries, stale and heavy, as if the walls themselves had not been touched, since a world older than Jerusalem had drowned into obscurity. There are stories of artifacts unlike any relics blessed by priests. Fragments of black stone carved into smooth circles, etched with patterns that resembled waves crashing in endless repetition. Small tablets inscribed with characters that resisted translation, curling lines that mirrored storms and spirals of the sea. These were not the treasures of prophets or kings. They were messages preserved in silence, as though the earth itself had hidden warnings beneath layers of conquest and blood. The knights who gazed upon these fragments could not agree on their meaning. Some whispered that they were remnants of a forgotten tribe, a people erased by God's judgment. Others claimed the symbols matched tales passed down from Greek philosophers, legends of an island swallowed by the ocean in a single night of fire and water. The more they studied, the more they feared, for the fragments spoke not of holiness, but of destruction beyond comprehension. To bring such findings into the light was unthinkable. The Church thrived on certainty, and certainty would fracture if men learned that empires greater than Rome had fallen, not by sword, but by the weight of their own arrogance. The Templars understood that this knowledge, if revealed, could shake kingdoms, undermine papal power, and stir fear among the faithful. Thus their silence deepened, and with each stone reburied, their secret grew heavier, pressing into their very souls. Legends later claimed they uncovered a map, not of cities or crusader routes, but of coastlines and islands long vanished. It was said the markings pointed west, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, toward waters feared and unexplored. If true, then the Templars stood upon evidence of Atlantis itself, a world remembered in myth but preserved in stone. Yet instead of proclaiming discovery, they bound themselves to silence, convinced the truth would destroy far more than it could save. And so their greatest revelation remained buried, guarded not with chains but with oaths. The world above celebrated them as defenders of faith, but beneath the earth they had touched a legacy drowned in the sea. What they saw was not a promise but a warning. Civilizations rise and fall, and water waits for all. Share this story with one who still seeks truth, for secrets such as these cannot survive alone in silence. They demand to be remembered. The discoveries beneath the Temple Mount were not without cost. What the Knights uncovered was not merely fragments of stone, but fragments of truth, and truth demands payment. Some of the brothers could not endure the weight of what they had seen. Their prayers grew hollow, their eyes haunted, their silence more oppressive than any vow. Knowledge had burned them, and in that fire the order began to fracture in ways the world above could not see. Chroniclers do not record their doubts, for doubts were not meant to be preserved. Yet whispers echo of men who abandoned the order quietly, unable to reconcile faith with the abyss they had glimpsed. Others became fanatical, convinced that their discoveries confirmed a destiny beyond the Church's reach. Unity was the order's armor, but knowledge pierced deeper than any sword, and the wound it left would bleed for centuries, hidden beneath rituals of obedience and prayer. There are tales of a knight who spoke aloud of what he had seen, declaring that the earth itself had betrayed its masters once before and would do so again. His words spread fear, and soon he vanished, erased from records as if his voice had never been raised. Such disappearances were not rare, for the Templars understood that silence was survival. To break the vow was to forfeit not only loyalty, but existence itself. The burden grew heavier as their influence expanded. With land, wealth, and armies came eyes that watched closely, enemies who would seize upon any weakness. To reveal the truth would mean destruction, not only for the order, but for Christendom itself. They chose secrecy, and in that choice they condemned themselves to carry a weight no crown, no pope, no king could bear. What was uncovered beneath Jerusalem would remain entombed, not in earth, but in the hearts of men sworn to die before speaking. Every relic was reburied, every fragment concealed, yet memory cannot be buried so easily. Dreams of waves, symbols of spirals, and visions of drowned cities followed them into battle, into prayer, into restless sleep. They carried not just swords and shields, but the ghost of a world erased. And with every march into war, they wondered if their fate would mirror the fate of the empire they had uncovered, glorious, powerful, and destined to drown beneath the weight of its pride. The price of knowing was silence, sacrifice, and slow corruption. Their strength before the world was built upon foundations of secrecy, and that foundation trembled beneath the pressure of what they carried. To those who listen now, know this: truth is never free. It devours those who seek it and spares only the ignorant. If you wish to uncover more of what was hidden, show your support, like this story, and help us drag more buried history into the light.